أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Welcome back to the lesson on, or the course on logic, and today will be the fifth lesson of the series, and we're going to continue off from last week. We finished lesson 2 of the book. We have lesson 3 to do today, lesson 4. We'll quickly go by those, and then we'll start with lesson 5, which is going back into technicality. So lesson 3 and 4, not so technical. Lesson 5, we get back into the technical stuff. So I'm hoping that we can go through everything today. We have about 45 minutes, so inshallah we can go ahead and do that. We can have a live. Right, so lesson 3 is with regards to the usage and definition of logic as an instrumental science. The scholars of the past, following what the Greeks used to do, Aristotle specifically, before delving into any science, they would first define or answer questions for what they call the 8 headings, al-ru'us al-thamaniya in Arabic. And basically, it's a bunch of questions they ask with regard to the science itself. So before delving into it, there are things that have to be known, such as the definition of the science, the usage of the science. I mean, you have to justify why the science is useful, or why there should be a science as the one you're claiming to have or you're introducing. And again, it goes kind of back to the ideas that we were discussing in the past few lessons with regards to conceptualization. Before really going into any science or any thing that you want to acquire in life, you first have to conceptualize why this thing that you want to do is important. And you have to introduce it to other people by letting them understand why they should spend their time studying this science. How is it going to benefit them? What is this science? First of all, you have to give them a conceptualization of the nature of the science, the subject matter of the science, the goal of the science, and the benefits of the science, the uses of the science. And there's, a whole, the author of the science, the inventor of the science. So there's a bunch of questions that were posed at the beginning. Usually they're defined at the beginning of the books on these sciences. That's how they used to do them before. Logic has been something that, at least in the Hawza, in the seminaries, not just logic, even if you go to fiqh or usul fiqh or philosophy even, you find that the books are in this order. First of all, they define the science, and the answer, not all of them answer the 8 questions. Some of them just are, suffice with 3, let's say the definition, the subject matter, and the objectives of the science, just to kind of give you an idea what the science is and why you should be studying it and what to expect from studying the science, what to gain from it. So when it comes to logic, the goal or purpose of logic, as mentioned by Aristotle and later logicians as well, who sort of walk into the path of Aristotelian logic, is to explain the correct method of thinking and the discovery of the unknown. This is a general purpose or goal of the science. The usage of logic is we use it to make the mind immune from erring in thinking by observing its rules, the rules of logic. So why should you study logic? Well, when you're thinking, you make mistakes in the process of thinking. What logic helps you do, it corrects your way of thought so that you think in a correct manner, that you don't make mistakes in the process of your thinking. Something which you might think is true. By studying these rules, you're able to verify whether that thought or that belief that you have is correct or not. This is the usage of the science. So technically, if you follow the rules of logic, you should not make mistakes in the way you think. This is the objective of it. It teaches a person how to utilize axiomatic knowledge in order to discover conceptual and assenting unknowns. So basically, if everything we have in this world that the mind is able to grasp is either a concept or a belief in a sense, then studying logic would assist you in knowing or discovering unknowns that you previously did not know. Now, the definition of logic, and I took this from the Mantiq al-Muzaffar book, is a famous definition. I believe Ibn Sina, Avicenna, is the first one to formulate it in this manner, from what I know, but I have to review that. But it's defined as a canonical tool. If one takes heed of this tool, he will have his mind immunized from error. So basically, it's a tool, and it's canonical, meaning it's a canon, it has laws that you have to follow, rules that you follow. And it's a tool, and we'll understand why he mentioned tool in a little bit. And there's a condition. If one takes heed of this tool, he will have his mind immune from error, basically. So there are conditions here. First of all, or let's discuss this definition, term by term. So there are rules. There's laws and regulations. So it's a science that's composed of rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are described as being a tool. Why a tool? Because logic is used in other sciences. It's sort of like a carpenter. He has tools which he uses for building things. You don't just acquire tools for the mere sake of acquiring tools. Themselves, they don't do anything for you. If you have a hammer and a saw and nails and you just have them lying around in the room, they're tools. They're of no benefit if they're not applied to something else. The objective is to build a house, to build a chair, to build a table. And in order to achieve that, you have to use tools. So you invent the tools in order to achieve that objective. Logic in itself is not a science that you learn for its own sake. It doesn't help you in its own self. There's nothing you gain or earn by memorizing all the rules of logic. The only time that logic becomes beneficial is when you use it in other sciences. So basically, if you're thinking, let's say you're doing mathematics or science or biology, physics, economics, whatever it is, logic is supposed to help you think in all of these different fields. When you analyze, when you argue, when you try to prove something, the arguments that you use in these other sciences, these are, or these follow the rules of logic. So that's why logic was described as a tool in this definition. The end of the science is not itself. It's a means for another end, basically other sciences. Then the author says that there's a condition though. You don't just learn the rules of logic and then automatically you start thinking correctly and then you become immune from committing error in your thought. You have to take heed of this tool. There's a lot of, one of the criticisms that people have against logic is that, well, people study logic but they still make mistakes in their thought. They still make mistakes in their thinking. And even logicians themselves sometimes, he can be an expert in logic, yet he'll make a mistake in thinking in another science, let's say. The reply is that this is why this condition was put in there. A lot of people learn the rules of grammar and syntax and how to speak in a language or how to write. They learn the rules of writing. However, when they come to write, they still make mistakes. That's why if you're writing, it would be good to have an editor. An editor will look over the mistakes that you committed, even though you might be a professional writer. So just learning the rules of grammar doesn't make you immune from committing grammatical mistakes. Similarly, logic, if you learn the rules of logic, but you don't follow the rules, or sometimes you could be oblivious of it, or sometimes you could just, let's say you're arguing for something, and your emotions get into play, then you end up, committing a fallacy, even though you're aware that this is a fallacy. But because your emotions, or you're belonging to a certain ideology or a certain thought, a school of thought, or you're convinced about something, you commit those fallacies and those mistakes in your thought, Basically, one moment, apologize. Forgot to record. Okay. All right, so the recording of the Zoom starts from here. You'll have to watch the regular video to catch up to this point. I forgot to put the recording button. Let me just make sure that it's recording. Yes, it is. Okay. So basically, to summarize, it's a tool, science that's a tool that you use for other sciences. It has rules and regulations that you have to follow. And just like a person who studies grammar and still commits mistakes in writing, a person who studies logic could also commit mistakes in argumentation if he doesn't take heed of this tool. If he does, though, then there should not be any error committed in the process of thought and argumentation. So basically, just to go back to the previous point, they divide the sciences into fundamental sciences and instrumental sciences. And the reason why they divide them into this is by using this criteria over here. Fundamental sciences are sciences which are not prerequisites of other sciences. You study them for themselves. They are the ends. The end of that science is the science itself. The subject matter and whatever you learn in that, the material that you learn in that science, is in itself beneficial. Let's say biology is an example of that. You learn it, having that information in itself is beneficial. There are sciences that are prerequisites of other sciences. Prerequisites in the sense that the science itself has no benefit if not applied to another science. Like an example we used was a carpenter with tools trying to build a house. The tools in themselves have no value, have no usage unless they're applied to building. So instrumental sciences, they say like algebra, for example, or logic in itself. You learn them in order to apply them to other sciences. So this differentiation between sciences is to understand the type of science logic. So logic is an instrumental science because it teaches us how to think and argue and verify information in other sciences. Now, lesson 4, the formulator of logic. The author of the book that we're using talks about descriptive and prescriptive sciences, and I thought we have to define these first. And then we'll come to figuring out whether logic is descriptive or prescriptive. A descriptive science is a science that describes how things are. It tells you that this is how a thing is. And let's say, for example, psychology, in a sense, is descriptive because it tells you how the human psyche functions. Or physics, it tells you how the universe functions. Or biology, it tells you how the body functions. So it just tells you how things are. Now, we have prescriptive sciences, prescribes things, as they also call it a normative science. It's a science that prescribes or says how things ought to be. Ethics, for example. It could define, in a sense, it could be descriptive by telling you lying is so and so and so, but that might not be the job of ethics. Ethics would tell you that lying is bad. So it's prescribing something. It's telling you how something should be. Lying is bad, therefore you should not lie. It's not describing the thing itself. Now, a science could be from one aspect descriptive, from one aspect prescriptive, but usually they're differentiated from one another. Now, when it comes to logic, there's, in general, logic has been described as a, if you're talking about the time of Aristotle, for example, if we look here, I'm thinking before modern European philosophy, I think it was agreed upon that logic was a prescriptive science. It teaches you how to think. There are people who argue that logic is descriptive and not prescriptive because it describes the process of the mind and how it thinks. So there is this debate between whether logic is prescriptive, is it really telling us how to think, or is it just telling us how the mind functions, how it functions in its thinking process. So this is something that we can think about. So some argue that it's prescriptive because it tells us how we ought to think. Others argue that it's descriptive because it tells us how the mind functions in its process of thinking and rationalization. So when it comes to inventing the science of logic, Aristotle, when he came to formalize or formally invent this science, can we say that before Aristotle no logic existed? Is this a claim that we can make? What do you think? Can we say that logic did not exist before Aristotle? Since he's the one who invented the science and he wrote it down, obviously there was nothing called like the science of logic before him. So did logic just not exist before?
It existed but wasn't formulated in concise definitions and set into a science. It was always there.
Okay,
Kind
so
of like how fire always existed, but humans learned how to, more easily access it and use it for their own, uses.
okay, so okay, I like the example of fire. You're saying that fire existed, or to be maybe more precise, the laws of the universe that would allow for a fire to occur existed.
Yeah.
But the people didn't know about this. So let's say Newton, for example, when he was sitting under that tree, and the apple fell down and hit his head, and he's like, "Oh, gravity." So nobody spoke about gravity before that. But that doesn't mean that only when he realized that gravity became something invented. Like now, gravity exists. It didn't come because he figured it out at that moment. It was always there, but nobody formalized it. Nobody wrote it down into like a rule, or no one defined it, or no one used it in a science. So he discovered something that was always there with the universe. So the argument that they make, and John Locke, for example, is he has a statement over here. He says that God did not make men barely two-legged and leave it to Aristotle to make them rational. What he's trying to say is that humans have always been rational. But nobody wrote it down. Nobody sat down and tried to analyze how the mind functions when it argues for something. Every day people argue about stuff. And I don't mean argue like in a negative way, argue meaning like they try to prove something to someone. You go to the supermarket and you want to buy something, or you talk to your family members, or every single day you're building arguments throughout your daily life. But nobody sat down and tried to understand how the human mind builds these arguments, and therefore see where the mind makes mistakes and where it doesn't make mistakes until Aristotle came. Now there was logic that was discussed pre-Aristotle in the East. So we have Indian logic, predates Aristotle. We have Chinese logic, but it's not completely. Nobody can make the claim that Aristotle took this idea from the East. I don't think that can be definitely set. Just because something existed before, let's say in the East, they studied logic and it existed before Greece discovered it, Aristotle discovered it, just because it precedes it or predates it, doesn't mean that this was taken from that. It just could happen that someone in the East or the West also thought of the same idea, and it happens many times. Sometimes, you're sitting down and you think about something, and you think, oh wow, this is an amazing idea. You go online and you find that someone else had thought the same thing. Now, it doesn't mean that you took the idea from that person. It's just that because you're a human, and humans are conditioned to think in a certain way, you were in the same conditions and you had the same thoughts or similar thoughts to that other individual, and you arrived to the same conclusion. And similarly, logic could be the same thing. I don't know if Aristotle or Greece had borrowed books from the East and kind of introduced logic by borrowing it from that part of the world, or Aristotle kind of figured it out himself. Now, before Aristotle, there are some indications in a few Greek philosophers before him, giving certain rules for grammar, or not just grammar, language, how to structure a sentence, and some argue that that has some logical rules in it. But nobody actually formalized a science called logic until Aristotle came to be. Again, that doesn't mean that logic didn't exist. Logic exists as long as human beings, as rational beings, do exist, because this is how the mind functions. The mind puts premises and draws conclusions from it. The mind understands the law of non-contradiction. The mind itself functions this way. You tell someone that something cannot exist and not exist at the same time and place with all the same condition. It's just that the mind itself is programmed in a way to think in this manner. Aristotle is the one who came and said, let me sit down and let me figure out, what are the rules or the method by which the human mind functions. And since, we do have emotions and we do have feelings and we do have a lot of other things that interfere with our minds and our process of thought, let me come up with a system that would be free of any error. If humans follow the system, then they're able to have their intellect overcome their emotions and their feelings, and therefore not be influenced by things that would make them think in a wrong way. So for example, if you're someone who believes that, let's say, a certain football team is the strongest team, is the best team, it should always win, and someone else argues that, they can't always win because, the players keep changing, the players themselves get fatigued. There's many different factors. But you find that person, even though the mind would agree with the second individual, but he just, he stubbornly doesn't accept that. Just because his emotions, they interfere in his process of thought. His attachment to this team, his love for the team, don't allow him to think outside or even accept something such as them losing or them being, beneath or lesser than other teams. So many examples. So Aristotle sat down, wrote the rules to kind of avoid that kind of thinking, those mistakes in thinking. One question we have here, we're not really going to delve into it too much, is the study of logic forbidden in Islam? Now, why is this question even posed in the first place? Well, there's a long history, and I'm not going to delve into it, but there are scholars who forbade studying logic, and there are scholars until this day who oppose logic or in the study of logic and do not believe that it should be taught in Islamic seminaries, and Muslims should not learn it. Now, some of them make an exception. They say that the only reason why you would be allowed to learn it is to falsify it. So basically, you learn the science in order to criticize it and falsify it. Other than that, you're not allowed to learn the science. And they have different arguments. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just put a few over here so we can kind of just get an idea if you ever run into a book where, they say logic is forbidden, or you have like an attack on philosophy and other sciences. It mainly begins with attacking logic in the first place. So there are scholars who consider studying logic haram, forbidden. There are those who consider it to be wajib, obligatory. And there are those who kind of said, well, it's neither this or that. It could be haram sometimes, it could be wajib sometimes, it could be neither one of them. If you want to, it's like an extra thing. It's like learning how to ride a bicycle. It's not haram, it's not wajib. You can learn it, there's nothing wrong with it, but really there's no benefit in it. So there are those three positions. There are a few more. I mean, this third one over here, we can go into different categories for that as well. But let's take Ibn Taymiyyah, for example. He said that he made the study of logic forbidden, and he openly criticized it. In fact, he wrote books, volumes, criticizing logic. Now, obviously, when you read those books, you notice that he's using logic to criticize logic, right? Now, and this is the irony over here. Anybody who attacks logic, he's forming arguments when he's attacking logic. Logic is, let's say, make an argumentation. Logic is an external science, external to Islam. Every external science is haram to study, therefore logic is haram to study. I mean, that's a syllogism. That's what logic teaches you to do. It teaches you how to think. So even if you want to criticize logic, you can't but think in a logical manner. So logicians, when they came to defend this, they told Ibn Taymiyyah and other people that, well, you cannot escape from using logic. Logic is just the way the mind functions. This is what it is. It's a science to describe how the mind thinks. But things that would scare them and bother them is that, first of all, it's an imported science. The Quran never came with a system of logic and never came and said study mantiq. Hadith never mentioned it. The Prophet never talked about it. So therefore, if it was so important, then why didn't the Quran and the Prophet mention this thing? Why didn't they come and tell people to go and study logic? Why did Islam allow people to worship and believe in it without studying logic, if logic is so necessary? At least, you would have found indications in the Hadith or the Quran referring to, the necessity of studying logic. Why don't we have any of this? So that's one point they make. Another point is that sometimes if you follow the rules of logic, you might end up reaching conclusions that are contrary to what the Prophet has mentioned or the Quran has mentioned. This is a claim. Really, you have to go into a lot of detail about this, which claim specifically, and let's say, for example, one issue that Ibn Sina had a problem with was physical resurrection. He believed, according to his philosophy and his rules of philosophy, which follow logic as well, that technically, philosophically speaking, rationally speaking, a person cannot be resurrected after death with his body. It's impossible. So a belief like that kind of goes in opposition with what the Quran and the Hadith have mentioned. They spoke about a physical resurrection, people being revived from their death after this world. And when it comes to the Day of Judgment, their hands will be asked, their tongues will be asked. And we have a lot of ahadith and verses that talk about the body suffering in the hereafter, or the body being rewarded for what it did. So what do you do with these ahadith? If it's impossible for a body to be resurrected after it goes into non-existence, let's say the rule of non-contradiction, something cannot exist and not exist, or you cannot bring something into existence from complete non-existence. So let's say a person dies, this world is annihilated, right? Day of Judgment happens, world is annihilated, non-existent, gone. Then we have another world where the body that was just annihilated, it was resurrected again. Well, how can you resurrect something that was annihilated? Once it goes, you can't even point to it anymore. It's not there. So what are you resurrecting? You can't. It's gone. It's non-existent. Non-existent means it has no existence. So you can't even talk about it. You can't even think about it. You can't even point to it. It's gone. It's completely gone. So this might lead to, for example, someone saying, well, you know what? This bodily resurrection thing has to mean something else. It doesn't mean actual physical resurrection. Ibn Sina said, if it wasn't for the prophetic hadith and the Quran, I wouldn't have believed in it. But he did give the prophetic hadith and the Quran more weight than his own thought, because he gave room for himself to make errors because of him being a human being. But the Quran and the Prophet, they're free from errors. They're infallible. But according to his system of logic, you can. So this is one example. Let's say you have 100 examples where you start looking at, religious texts and you kind of figure out, well, this logically doesn't make sense. And logically meaning this kind of logic. A lot of people come and say, well, logically that doesn't make sense. Well, if you think about it logically, and they don't merely mean logic. What they mean is something called common sense, which also there's a lot of error in their own thinking. A lot of people coming and say, that come and say, Islam is with logic, and logic says this. Most of the time, they're not really using logic in the technical sense. There could be a lot of fallacies in the way they're thinking. They're thinking that they're thinking logically, but that's another error. Logic will teach you how to avoid that kind of error as well. But anyways, the second point is that you reach conclusions that are contrary to Islamic belief. And another argument is that it creates more confusion than it does clarity. Now, after we study this course, we'll figure out whether we're more confused or, you have a lot of rules you have to follow. But the thing is, if the mind is trained on something, at first it's difficult. It's like teaching a child grammar. At first, they're going to keep making mistakes. It's difficult. How many grammatical rules do I have to learn and memorize? You go buy a grammar book right now, like for adults. And they're pretty thick books. They're not easy. And you think to yourself, my God, how can I? But through practice, they become second nature. So this is something that could be resolved. It's not a big issue. But they might mean something else. other than that kind of thing, you know. They could mean that if you begin allowing everything to be judged by these logical principles, then you're going to have to resolve many problems that you never had before. And therefore, you get into more confusion, and this is not something that we want a believer to go into. We want people to have strong faith and strong beliefs, and not everybody is able to tolerate such a thing. And there's a rule, this last point over here, it's a principle. Different scholars have argued for and against it. So basically it states that muqaddimatul harami haram. So the prerequisite of a forbidden act is forbidden. So for example, if you want to, let's say do a haram act, and this haram act requires that you do something before it. For example, they use this when they want to forbid looking at a woman that's not someone's mahram, not related to him, or he's not allowed to look at her, like his wife or his one of his sister or mother. One way they would that, well, since zina is haram, and the prerequisite to zina is to look at that person, therefore looking at that person should be haram, because it leads to that haram. So this is one argumentation they use in the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. So when it comes to philosophy, you want to apply that rule to philosophy or to logic, well, these clearly forbade philosophy. To them, it's clear that philosophy is haram, then logic is haram. And we're not going to go into that. Maybe if there's a course taught on philosophy, we can discuss those arguments. But according to a lot of scholars, philosophy is forbidden. And when I say scholars, I don't mean Shia scholars or Sunni scholars, I mean in general. So if philosophy is forbidden, then the science that leads to philosophy, or that's considered to be a prerequisite for philosophy, should also be forbidden. And this is another argument that they have. So here you can argue against it by saying that philosophy is not forbidden technically, so therefore this is not forbidden either. That's one reply, and I think it suffices. And again, to argue that philosophy is haram, and then the prerequisite is haram, I mean, that's logic as well. You're forming a syllogism. So basically you're using logic to prove something. It's circular reasoning. You're using the thing itself to prove that it's forbidden to use it. It's a circular reasoning, so it's false. All right, so this is the end of lesson 3 and 4. Now we're going to go into lesson number 5. I'm just going to share the screen over here. Okay, so we move on to the next lesson. A discussion on expressions, alfaz, and logic. I don't think we have enough time to go through the whole thing today, but by next lesson I believe we're going to be caught up with the syllabus, inshallah. So this is considered to be a prerequisite to logic as well. Why is it necessary to understand expressions and logic? Basically, the general idea, and we'll go into details about it here on the slides, but the general idea, answering this question, why study semiotics, basically the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation, it's because there is a relationship between words and their meanings. If you have a word and you have a meaning for that word, when you say, for example, book, the sound book, or the letters B-O-O-K, the shape of those lines which make up those letters, or which those letters are formed of. When you say book, the person who hears the sound or reads the word automatically imagines the book in his mind. He knows what this is referring to. Even though the sound is not a book, the word is not an actual book. In fact, there could be no book at all, no book present. But you write book on a wall in an empty room, And a person who's seen books before, obviously, and he knows, the connection between the word and the meaning, if he comes in and he reads a book, automatically he's going to think of the book, which is the actual physical object. So how does a person be able to think of that form or image in his mind when it doesn't exist in front of him? Well, because there's a relationship that has been developed and ingrained in the human mind between the sound or the word and the meaning, in such a manner that if you mention the word, it's as if you brought the book itself. It's as if you've shown him the book itself. And this is the beauty and the magic of language. We're able to sit down, like me right now, speaking about all these ideas, and I'm just making sounds. There's only sounds coming out of my mouth. But you are able to understand what I'm saying. To you, it has meaning. To my cat, for example, she has no idea what I'm saying. Just like when she meows, and I have no idea what she's saying. Maybe she's formulating a very philosophical statement, and I'm just sitting there, just hearing, oh, it's meowing again. I called it like meowing. Just sounds coming out of her mouth. Well, I sound to the cat the same way that she sounds to me, because the cat doesn't have in her mind the relationship which us humans have between certain sounds and the meaning. So if I tell the cat, go and eat, now unless I've taught her that this sound, food, let's say, or eat, signifies that food over there. Sometimes you can teach an animal that, like with a dog, for example. Certain commands, they will understand. But you have to build the connection between the sound and the meaning. Because there is a relationship between words and meaning, and in logic, what the person is concerned with is the meaning. We have the things that we conceptualize and the beliefs that we make from those conceptualizations. These are forms and definitions that signify a meaning that's existential. We're not concerned with the words themselves. We're not worried about the shape of the letter. It could be any language. What we care about is the meaning that this is signifying, not the language itself. But because there's a relationship between language and meaning, we have to study language as well, because of the relationship that exists between these two things. So there's a relationship between word and meaning. Meaning is what logicians are primarily concerned with. Language is what conveys meaning. Therefore, language is studied because of its relationship with meaning. That's the only reason why we study language and logic. Now, what are the linguistic rules that we're concerned with in logic? Well, there are some rules that the logician is concerned with, other rules that he's not really concerned with. But before delving into that, Shaykh Mullafa talks about modes of existence. And the reason why he brings these about is to understand what logic or what the logician is concerned with primarily or directly. This will help you in philosophy as well. The reason why he mentions these, specifically Islamic philosophy. If you go into Islamic philosophy, you're going to talk about different modes of existence. So he describes what these are. He introduces them, not because he wants to delve into them, but because he wants to exclude certain things and tell you exactly what logic is concerned with. But having these in mind would help you in the future for studying philosophy, inshallah. So Shaykh Mullafa says there are 4 modes of existence. This is an Avicennian idea as well. Ibn Sina has it in his logic book as well. It's translated, one of his books on logic, Remarks and Admonitions, by Shams Inati, I believe her name is. It's a very concise book, and it's considered to be a more advanced text to study in logic. But Shaykh Mullafa does a good job in bringing some of his ideas and putting them here. He says there are 2 types of, 2 main categories. There are actual existence, modes of existence, and expressive mode of existence. The actual one exists independent of intentional association. So basically, when I say book, the word or the sound book doesn't automatically put in your mind the image of a book or the form of a book. So this book, for example, over here. Now, I go to China, for example, or Russia, and I have this book in my hand, I forget it at home, and I want to tell somebody about this book. I don't know the word book in Chinese or Russian. So I can't just make up a sound, or I can't just tell a book and assume that he's going to think, let's assume he doesn't know English. I can't just say book and say, oh, he should know what I mean. I'm telling you book. You know, there's people that when you go like to a foreign country or a foreigner comes and you try to speak with them, you somehow speak your own language, and you don't know the language and they don't know it. But you still speak your own language. You have no mode of communication with that person. You still speak with them in the language that you have, and you keep assuming, your mind just automatically assumes that the sound that you're coming out of your mouth, he should comprehend at least some of it. And then you get frustrated if that person's not getting what you're trying to say. Well, the reason is because when it comes to language, humans said that this sound, book, is associated with this over here. So when I say book, sound, it means this. Since you're a child, you're taught. There's a book, the word, the sound, the letters, they have the image of the book. The mind builds a relationship, a connection between both of them. Now, the first mode of existence is actual. So it does not depend on intentional association. Intentional association, or being nominal, is when I make an intentional association between the word book and the object book. The human being has to create that association. It doesn't exist in its own self. So the actual mode of existence does not depend on human association. For example, and this can be divided into two different categories. External existences, those that exist without the human being's mind. So the relationship between two things, whether the human existed or did not exist, they exist, and they're not something that's confined to his own mind. For example, physical objects, humans, trees, animals, they exist on the outside of the human being's mind. They don't depend on the human mind to exist. So I don't have to think about a tree for a tree to exist. It just exists on its own. The second one is the mental existence. And that is which exists within the human being's mind. Those are the existences that exist in my own mind. So it needs a human being for it to exist. For example, the images and forms of external things, concepts and definitions. So the tree exists. When I look at it and it imprints its image in my mind, it becomes mental existence. Now, it needs a human being with a mind to have that image imprinted in it. Now, why is that important? Well, in philosophy, they go into the importance of mental existence. Is it real? Is it accidental? Does it have any value? Is it stronger than the external existence in terms of existential realism or value? Or is the external object much, So let's say external object is a tree. It's confined to, let's say, space and time, and it's a limited form of existence. But the mental image is free of that limitation. Therefore, it's immaterial. Therefore, it must be superior to this existence. And some would argue otherwise. I mean, there's a whole discussion on the difference between external existence and mental existences, and which one is superior to the other. But we're not going to go into that. So these are the actual modes of existence. Then you have another mode of existence called an expressive mode of existence. And they're also divided into two different categories. Now, these exist because of intentional association. They're nominal. So if human beings did not make an intentional association, they would not exist. The divisions of this category are done into verbal and written. So verbal are words that are invented to convey meanings. Since we can't bring the objects that we're speaking about every single time, let's say I want to describe my new car to you. I bought a new car. I have to bring it every single time. If we had no language, I have to bring the car and say, like make sounds or whatever. Maybe no sounds even. Just, put it there and you see the car. I want to tell you it's red. Yeah, I have to bring it to you. Well, humans can't do that every time. Imagine every time you want to speak about something, you have to bring the thing that you're talking about for the other person to understand. They invented words and language to convey these things to one another. So the sounds that we've made, or that we've invented and that we've associated to the objects, are verbal modes of existence that fall under the category of expressive, because we made the association. The second one is written. So these are the symbols of words, the lines of the letters. You know, A being composed of 2 lines and 1 line going across, or B or whatever, the letters, the shapes of the letters, or the symbols that we have. Or the, you know, if you're ancient Egyptian, you would have images of things that would convey certain meanings. So we have verbal, the sounds that come out of it, and we have written, what we inscribe on paper. Logic is concerned with the last category over here. Now, I made a little thing here just to kind of be able to picture it. So we have an external existent, which is the tree itself. It looks like a broccoli, but it's a tree. I mean, if you put tree in the search thing, this comes up on Word.
Broccoli would work too, though, right?
Broccoli would work as well. I mean, okay, so you can imagine this to be a broccoli if this is what you see. You can imagine it to be a tree. I'll assume it's a tree for the sake of my own mental health, because I've been assuming it's a tree for the whole time. Well, I mean, Microsoft Word, if you put search for a tree, this is what comes out. So this is a human being. This exists. Whether this guy exists or not, the tree exists on its own. Now, the human being looks at it, and the brain records an image of the tree. So now we have the external tree. Now we have another tree. This other tree exists in the mind. It didn't exist before, but now it does due to the human mind seeing it. Now, next, the human being comes and says, tree. I'm going to call this a tree. So now there's a different type of existence, which is vocal, verbal. So when you say tree, you understand that kind of music. And then you have written, which is either drawing the tree on a paper or writing the word tree on a paper or anything that signifies a tree. So basically, the image in the mind is related to the actual tree. And the word tree refers to the actual tree as well. And what's on the paper refers to this as well. So all of these signify this. And there's a relationship between these things and the external object. So this is a summary or a chart of the modes of existence. And I think we're going to end the lesson for today on this point. Next week we're going to talk a bit in more detail about human beings and thinking in language, and the relationship between language and human thought, and then what logic does with language and with thinking as well. So we'll end it over here, and inshallah next week we can finish this off and hopefully go into lesson number 6 after that. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.